Hello and welcome to the World History Addicts Podcast Season 2. This is the second season of our show where we discuss history and geopolitics from a social and anthropological lens. I'm your host, Devon, and this episode will be about one of the most interesting alternate history scenarios and novels ever written, The Years of Rice and Salt. This book goes far beyond the alternate timelines of the Axis winning in World War II, like in Man in the High Castle, or the South winning the Civil War, like in Harry Turtledove's novels, because it shows a world without Europe, one where the Black Plague was so deadly that it killed everyone inside of Europe in the 1300s, and it shows how history progressed into modernity without the Western world. Let's begin. The Years of Rice and Salt was written back in 2002 by an author named Kim Stanley Robinson. And this is interesting because it was written less than a year after the 9/11 bombings, where the Twin Towers were taken down by several planes. And the reason I say this is it wasn't a very good time to be a Muslim in America. People were very angry about what had happened, but Kim Stanley Robinson really avoided that because he showed a very sympathetic view of Islam and the Islamic world and of Muslims, despite all this going down, even though to some degree he did view them as being the less progressive out of the other Eastern civilizations which survived the Black Death. The setting and the storytelling style of The Years of Rice and Salt is very Eastern as opposed to Western because it's built upon a kind of Buddhist framework that reincarnation is real and everyone dies and then is reborn as someone else. And sometimes not too long after their death, sometimes centuries after their deaths. And not only that, but people actually have a group of people that's like a spiritual family that they're continually reincarnated with called a jati. That's a Indian Buddhist term. And the timeline splits from our own in the early 1400s with the Black Death spreading into Europe much more aggressively than in our timeline. And it shows how Eastern Europe is, and later the rest of Europe, is just completely depopulated, as seen through the eyes of a Mongol who got lost from the rest of the horde and is just exploring Eastern Europe. By the way, the Mongol is actually the same as the other characters who appear later because he just keeps getting reincarnated, and you can tell because his name starts with B. His name is Bold, and there are later other characters who are. Who share the first letter of his name, B. Like there's Bihari, he's a character in India. There's another character named Busha, who's actually a samurai lost in the Midwestern region of what would have been the U.S. if the British and French hadn't been wiped out. Though it actually isn't until the 1500s that you start to see some real changes from what's going on in this world because Book 2, which also shows the last historic figure. His name's Mughal Emperor Akbar. Also shows the migrations into Europe from the Middle East and North Africa because no one's around to stop them from doing that. And it's I think that's also because book 1 and 2 are really about the kind of establishing the world of a world without Europe and reincarnation is real, and this is how the story's format is going to be, with the same characters who you can identify by the first letter of their name getting reborn over and over again. So Book 1 starts with the Mongol horseman named Bold, lost in Eastern Europe, and it introduces the concept of the jati. And speaking of which, it also introduces the concept that his jati actually formed when him and other people who were originally Tibetans actually all died in an avalanche somewhere in Tibet, and that's how the jati started. And these are the same people who continue on and keep getting reborn over and over throughout this story. Book 2 is about the recolonization or resettlement of Europe by Arabs, Turks, Berbers, and or Amazigh people, pretty much everyone on the periphery of Europe, because before, when the Europeans had been around, they were kept out by the Christian armies, but those people are all dead, so there's nothing stopping them from just moving in and setting up shop. So It also interestingly shows some of the author's political views because book 2, I think, actually starts. You can start to see his disagreements with Islam as like a social force. Because Kim Stanley Robinson, from what I can tell from basically how the book goes, is a social progressive and feminist, and he takes issue with how Islam is not that different from Christianity, at least in this point in time, in the 1500s. And there are lots of restrictions on what women can do and what people can do outside of the religious authorities. So they moved to what would have become the Kingdom of France, and they set up their own unique kind of society because in the absence of the centralized authorities of different sultans or imams from the Middle East or North Africa, they're able to create a very unique, much more liberal society. Though eventually they end up getting crushed because more radical settlers start moving in and they start laying down the law. So they have to just keep fleeing further into Europe, into other places that aren't under the control of the authorities. Book 3 is also where you start to get Kim Stanley Robinson's views on history, because his view seems to be that history will continue on in basically the same way with or without Europe. And you can see this because instead of there being Christopher Columbus and his 1492 voyage to the Caribbean, we instead have a 1600s voyage from China to California. There's a crew of Chinese Navy men, and I don't think they're entirely from China. Some of them are also like mercenaries from Southeast Asia. But the plan is that they're supposed to invade Japan and deal with them because the Japanese are just refusing to cooperate with the Chinese emperor. So they want to just invade and force them to comply with the terms. But instead, they get blown off course. They hit this current that takes them all the way across the Pacific, all the way to California, where they meet up with several Native Americans, and they even end up getting into a gunfight with the Incans instead of Pizarro. It's a group of Chinese sailors, and they actually managed to get all the way back to China, and they bring news that there's this entirely new civilization on the other side of the Pacific that no one else seems to know about. And this is also very interesting to me because it shows how many of the factors that led to the mass genocides and the mass displacement of Native Americans weren't entirely specific to Europe, because an Arab army or a Chinese army or even an army from India probably could have gotten the same results if they had had the same naval technology that would let them go across the Pacific or the Atlantic Oceans, because they had plague. They had the advantage of plagues. Like even within just a few, I think like a week of the Chinese sailors landing in California, there were these huge smallpox outbreaks because some of the sailors had actually had smallpox as a child, and they still carried the virus with them. So even though they didn't have any kind of symptoms of it, the people there who didn't have any immunity to smallpox just started dying off. Also, there's the fact that they had horses and metal armor and weapons, as well as guns, because by this point, the 1600s, they don't even just have the old matchlock heavy arquebuses that the Spanish conquistadors use. There's even a section where the Chinese captain in charge of the expedition actually pulls out a flintlock pistol and uses it to keep a group of Incan warriors from sacrificing him. And Book 4 is also another kind of parallel history, because it shows how science would have appeared anyway without the West, because instead of Sir Isaac Newton discovering the scientific method and gravity and all the other laws of physics, a group of Uzbekistani scholars just stumble upon them instead. The story in Book 4 is that a group of these scholars, well, one of them turns out to be a fraudster because he tries to get the Sultan, or I think it was the Emir in Samarkand, to fund his research into turning lead into gold, which turns out to be completely fake. So he gets his hand cut off, and he becomes very angry after this and just decides that he wants to quit doing science and research. But his friends instead encourage him to dedicate his life to figuring out how much of everything they've assumed to be true actually is true and correct, which turns out that most of it's actually wrong, because they figure out how to find a methodical way to do experiments and use the experiments to make testable, repeatable results and collect the data and use that to make more predictions. So they actually end up pioneering science despite having zero connection to Europe. And this eventually lays the groundwork for a few later books. Book 5 is actually my favorite, just because the main character is actually the reincarnated version of the Mongol rider in the first book, but this time he's a samurai, and he's, instead of being in Eastern Europe, he's in America, and meets up with several Native American tribes called the Iroquois Confederacy. And in this world, they're not facing pressure from the English or the French or the Spanish. Instead, their main enemy is the Arabs, who've been colonizing the east coast of the U.S., and they're moving west towards Iroquois land. Though by this point, the reason he's in America is because Japan has actually been conquered by China, and there are all these Japanese refugees hanging out in North America. And he realizes that China is also on its way to colonize the western, like the Pacific coast of the United States. And if they keep doing this and they don't do something, eventually the Native Americans will get conquered the same way Japan was. So this Ronin finds a way to become like the leader of a Native American tribe, and he teaches them how to write using the Japanese styles, how to make metal weapons and swords, and basically how to wage war in an East Asian instead of Native American fashion against these other Middle Eastern or Chinese foes. And eventually they end up being able to create an entirely independent Native American state between the Arabs in the East and the Chinese in the West. Book 6 is less about the parallel. I guess it's kind of about the parallel evolutions of different developments, but this one is less about the technology and more about the philosophy. This one is about how liberal ideas and progressive ideas could still appear even without without Western civilization. Because in this one, which is about this woman in Western China, which is kind of between the Chinese world and the Islamic world, she starts comparing like Confucian ideas with Islamic ideas, and realizes that both of them are centered around the patriarchy and about how men, especially religious men, have to be in charge of everything. And she starts to question why that should be the case, because she's a widow and she can't rely on any kind of husband. So because of that, and she writes many ideas about her views on how everyone's fundamentally equal. And I think she actually tries drawing on to both certain Islamic ideas, like the idea that everyone has a soul, or the Buddhist ideas that everyone fundamentally has a kind of shared humanity within the idea of being reincarnated over and over again. And they create a kind of alternate version of liberalism, but it's Chinese Islamic instead of like European or Protestant. And this eventually leads into Book 7, which is about an alternate industrial revolution. But instead of happening in England or anywhere in Europe, it happens in southern India, in this place called the Kerala of Travancore. The Travancores also create their own kind of industrial, overseas empire. They actually take over parts of Australia, and they even manage to take over the southern part of Africa, believe it or not, which I guess puts them in a similar position as kind of like the Dutch or the Portuguese in this world. They're not as strong as the Chinese, but they are a bit more advanced in some ways around industry. They even managed to defeat an Ottoman army all the way up in the Mediterranean by using hot air balloons and time fused bombs. And at this point, and this is actually one of the more important chapters, I think, because it shows that modernity could still exist without Europe. You could have like Indian factories and Chinese factories that are just showing up without any kind of influence from a capitalist European force imposing it on them. But unfortunately, the progress eventually leads into their equivalent of the world wars, because I think Kim Stanley Robinson's view on this is that European nationalism led to the world wars, but the real underlying cause behind all of it was just modernity itself. And anyone who adopts modernity will eventually face massive, horrible, deadly conflicts like the world wars. In their case, instead of it being two world wars, it's one gigantic conflict that spans about 60 years. Though in this world, there's no British Empire, there's no German Empire, there's no Austria-Hungary, there's no United States. So instead, there's like the Greater Chinese Empire, and its main enemy is just the entire Islamic world, and the Indians and Japan and the Haudenosaunee League, or the independent Native Americans, also join the Chinese side, and eventually they're able to overwhelm the Muslim side, which actually means that the war ends sometime, I think, in the 1970s or 80s instead of in the 1940s. And after this, it's a very different kind of world because I think by this point, China has kind of taken on the role that the United States took on in our world. They're very powerful, basically unchallengeable throughout the world. Though in our case, in the case of the Years of Rice and Salt, they're not democratic. Most of the countries around the world are at this point are not democracies like in our world. But even the great powers themselves, like China and India, are not really democratic. However, the World War ended without using nuclear weapons, but they still show up anyway because a few researchers in France, or what would have become France, are able to figure out that you can split the atom and you can release a huge amount of energy that can just destroy entire cities. There are two Muslim women who are also scientists. And they were kind of working underground because the society they live in is also still not very progressive and also very critical of their research, which they actually end up trashing and destroying because they realize that at some point someone is going to get a hold of these nuclear weapons and they're going to use it for just mass genocide. And eventually that will lead to the destruction of everything because if everyone has nuclear weapons and someone starts using them, it'll just lead to everyone just getting destroyed. So they destroy the evidence, buried it as well as they can. And one of them actually comes across a exhibit in a museum that's actually the same Tibetan village that started their whole jati in the first place. But she doesn't remember any of that, so she doesn't know why that's all happening. And finally, book 10 is about the present state of China. I think in some sense it's kind of like Kim Stanley Robinson's criticism of the United States, because his point, I think, was that once any superpower just becomes like the world hegemon, everything effectively becomes their problem because no one else is really around to blame for that. If you live in a bipolar world, like during the Cold War, you can kind of blame all the problems on the other side. Like America can blame all their issues on the USSR. The USSR can blame all of its issues on America and the Western capitalist world. But if America is the only superpower, then everything is kind of their fault. And in this world, they show how even though China has won and it's made great amounts of progress, there's still many problems. Like the government is still very authoritarian, and several attempts to dislodge the current government has only just led to more authoritarian governments showing up, and which is very kind of disheartening for the people involved in it. They also include a cameo of Kim Stanley Robinson's hometown in Davis, California, but in this world, it was taken over by China, and I don't think the English language even exists anymore, so it's called Fangzhang instead of Davis. So what can we take away from the plausibility or the accuracy of the Years of Rice and Salt? It's interesting, but I don't think it's very plausible. The entire story basically assumes that every single civilization has the same motivation and the same tools to be able to modernize, which is just not true. Europe is really the exception to the rule, and really modernity is only about 200 years old at the very most, maybe even younger than that. I actually made a video called When Did the Modern World Begin? You can check that out, where I make the argument that it actually began around the mid-1800s, once industrialization reached a critical mass. But for most of the world, tradition was much more important than progress. Like in the Confucian world, in the Islamic world, in the Hindu world, defending tradition has always been put above progress and improving everything. And it's really only in specific parts of Western Europe, like Britain, that the idea that reason is superior and that progress is a greater good and progress, freedom, equality, all these things are a greater good than perhaps even than Christianity itself. That's actually one of the reasons why Western Europe is actually one of the least religious places in the world today. It's because they eventually came to the conclusion that progress is better than faith. I don't know if that line of reasoning would have taken hold throughout much of the world in this world that doesn't have any kind of that has zero Europeans, not just no Brits or no French or no Germans, but just none of them. Also, there's the fact that I don't think anything similar to the Protestant Reformation would have taken place, because the Protestants laid the precedent that everything should be provable and that authority should always be questioned, and that eventually led into the Enlightenment, and from the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution into the Industrial Revolution, which kept snowballing until eventually we had modernity. But nothing like that seems to really be going on. You get a few heretics and dissidents like the various feminist thinkers in the Years of Rice and Salt, but I don't think many of them would have been very successful. Because I think the unfortunate truth with many revolutions is that lots of them are actually driven from the top. It's actually nobles and aristocrats who agree with these Enlightenment ideas who actually start pushing them on the rest of society. And eventually from there, change starts to happen. It's not always just the bottom rising up. It's often the top just realizing that they're wrong and wanting to improve. So what would have happened instead? I think that in the vacuum of the European extinction, some of what Kim Stanley Robinson said, like Europe being recolonized by people from North Africa and the Middle East, probably would have happened. The real issue, I think, is that the Americas probably wouldn't have been colonized or even discovered because there was just no real drive to do it. And that's assuming that they had the same type of naval technology that the Europeans had, which I don't think they did, because the reason Columbus even went on his expedition in the first place is they wanted to find better and easier trade routes to China and India. The Portuguese were already sailing around Africa to bypass the Ottomans in the Eastern Mediterranean because they kept raising the prices and making trade really inconvenient. So it was actually easier to sail around Africa and just bypass all of that. But in this world, the people who live in Europe are also Muslims, so they don't have to worry about that. And in China's case, it's even worse because not only do they have to go across the Pacific, which is much larger than the Atlantic, but they are already very wealthy inside of China. They already have lots of land, lots of amenities, and whatever they don't have in China, they can just import from India or the Middle East, or maybe even Africa, because the idea that they would need something from America is just kind of out of the question. It's not even really something that would be taken seriously. There's also the industrial 19th century and the world wars, which I also think probably wouldn't happen. I don't think globalization would have taken root as easily. The main, I think, conduit for globalization and before the European age of exploration was really the Silk Road, which is much more inconvenient than just being able to sail around using steamships. And of course, there's nothing really comparable to the Protestant Reformation that triggered all of these other revolutions like the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. So I don't think most of this would have happened. If it did happen, it would have happened much later in the timeline. It wouldn't have just been basically just 1914, World War I happens regardless of who's around. It probably would have happened many centuries later, maybe in the 2200s or the 2300s even. However, despite all of these issues, I do think it's still a very interesting story. And outside of all the inaccuracies, I think many more of my problems with the book come from it not going into some of the more interesting subjects, like what was the independent Native American Haudenosaunee League like? Like, what was it like to live there? They seem to be the most democratic people out of all the different civilizations in this post-European world. And also, they didn't talk. Kim Stanley Robinson could have written a lot about Africa and this alternate Africa that appears without the transatlantic slave trade, and I think that would have been very interesting. Like there could have been a parallel of like Wakanda that existed and was just as wealthy as like China or the United States, but he didn't do that. And I also think he could have done more to talk about the aesthetics of this alternate non-European world because. Like, for example, in The Legend of Korra, the cars that they created actually look more like Chinese carriages, but with like motors and glass windows. And the suits and coats that they have actually look more like a progression from kimonos and Chinese robes instead of from like the European doublets. That's the origin of our modern Western suits and coats. And I was also really interested in what the airplanes and the machine guns would have looked like if they'd been invented by engineers from the Haudenosaunee League or from India instead of like people from Germany or England. But unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot of that. Overall, I think the Years of Rice and Salt says quite a bit about the human condition because it talks about the fact that you can remove an entire race of people and an entire continent, but people will still be people. People will still invent, people will still explore, people will still get into really stupid conflicts that lead to millions and millions of people dying. And also, you'll always have people who will go against the grain and will challenge the status quo. In Kim Stanley Robinson's case, he believed that eventually those people would win out. I think they probably wouldn't. But regardless, they still exist either way. He also points out that there are going to be drawbacks in any given society. Like in our world, we still have a kind of nuclear standoff, like between America and Russia, or America and China, and possibly America and North Korea. Though I think most of their nuclear threats, I think, are mostly a bluff just to get more concessions. They don't actually want to use those weapons. But in Kim Stanley Robinson's world, the people who discover how to make nuclear weapons actually choose to destroy all the evidence of them and make it as difficult as possible to make use of them, because their values and their priorities are completely different. They're a lot less interested in progress or becoming the reigning civilization as they are with just preserving all of humanity and avoiding a nuclear apocalypse. And also, I think KSR, Kim Stanley Robinson himself, was interested in Buddhism when he wrote the story. That kind of informs why he wrote the way he did. But even then, he is still a Westerner and still a liberal, and he brought in a lot of his ideas, which kind of show just how influential those ideas are today. Even in an alternate world without Europe, lots of European ideas still found their way in. So it's an interesting story, and it says a lot about human history and civilization, even if much of it was completely unintentional by the author. Thank you for listening to the World History Addicts Podcast. You can follow us on Instagram at the World History Addicts Podcast for more episodes, releases, and new content. Have a great day, and we hope you can join us again.